Hello, and welcome back. So today we're going to be talking about Chapter 6 of Biochemistry 1. It's going to talk about regulation of fuel metabolism by insulin, glucagon, and other hormones. So fuel metabolism, primarily we're going to be talking here at the beginning about glucose. And as we all know, our main source of energy for our body is glucose. Everything that we do that requires energy, we're going to be getting from essentially from glucose or from another source that is converted to glucose. We'll get into a lot of that. There's a lot of definitions and stuff in this chapter, words that kind of sound similar. So we'll make sure to spend some time to go over the differences of those to make sure we keep everything straight. Okay, so looking at our objectives, first and foremost, describe the importance of maintaining energy levels and glucose levels. We'll get a little bit into conditions like diabetes, which we know can have a hard time controlling blood sugar levels or glucose levels, saying the same thing. And essentially, if our glucose levels or our blood sugar levels are too high or too low, either way, either of those can cause some serious harm to our bodies. So describe the major hormones involved in fuel metabolism. We'll talk about those. Describe anabolic and catabolic pathways. We mentioned anabolic reactions and catabolic reactions earlier. So we'll get into those definitions again as well. Describe some general rules to remember concerning metabolism. Okay, jumping in. The major nutrients in our systems are carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Those are our big macromolecules that we're going to focus on. Carbohydrates is our most important one. So earlier we talked about proteins and how we have those essential amino acids. Those essential amino acids, remember to remember those. Good mnemonic. Private Tim Hall for most of our essential ones. And that was for developing of proteins. We talked about enzymes, all that sort of stuff, making those proteins. Now carbohydrates, we're going to focus more on the energy, and then kind of how we also use fats and proteins to convert them to glucose to use as energy as well. Okay, these nutrients provide energy for cellular function, as well as the maintenance of homeostasis. The fuels obtained from these major nutrients are glucose, free fatty acids, glycerol, amino acids, ketone bodies, and other metabolites. So kind of breaking this down a little bit. Glucose is from carbohydrates. The free fatty acid and our glycerol come from our fats. And then our amino acids are primarily from proteins. Ketone bodies are kind of its own thing. Ketone bodies if I remember correctly, they primarily come from fat. Ketone bodies are formed. If we've all kind of heard at this point of the certain diets, like the I'm spacing on the name right now. I don't think it's maybe the Atkins diet, or one of those diets where you eat zero carbohydrates, and the idea is that get your body into a state called ketoacidosis. What that means is that it's no longer has carbohydrates in your system. You've used up pretty much all of your glucose stores, and your body starts to burn fats and proteins, especially the fats that you have stored, to produce ketone bodies. And we'll get into a little bit more about that later. Again, different tissues are specialized and have differences in metabolism and utilization of various important fuels. However, in this section, we are discussing about the major mechanisms by which various hormones regulate fuel metabolism. So in the previous chapter, we discussed two major mechanisms of cell signaling. One mediated through the activation of plasma membrane receptors. Remember, we talked about the G protein coupled receptors. And the other is mediated through the activation of nuclear receptors. Remember those nuclear receptors, those big ones that we talked about? There was 3 specifically that we talked about. We talked about steroid hormone, thyroid hormone, and as well as vitamin D3 were those ones that we especially talked about. We will discuss here the mechanism by which these hormones mediate their actions through these receptors. For any other additional details, go back, check out the last video, check out the last chapter. All about that cell signaling and everything is in there. Okay, classes of hormones. So we saw this exact same chart in the last unit. I reminded you this is a very, very important chart. Lots of test questions and stuff will come from this chart. Really, really good one to sit down, spend some time with, learn all of these examples, learn what types they are, as well as their action. A lot of this here isn't super important. If you can pick out some key ones, like retinoid from vitamin A, the testosterone and vitamin D are from cholesterol, tyrosine, this will come back a lot. Okay, learn these, especially peptide, catecholamine, steroid, vitamin D, and thyroid are the big ones you want to remember. But again, learn this whole chart. This will help immensely in future classes as well if you learn this whole chart. Fuel supply to tissues are maintained. So ATP production and glucose levels in tissue must be kept constant for normal cellular function. Glucose is a metabolic necessity in all nutritional states. Okay, we'll start talking about nutritional states of like right after we eat versus what is actually technically considered a quote-unquote starving state. We'll get into that a little bit later. Nutritional states is kind of talking about what our current condition is based on like how long it has been since we have consumed sources of glucose. Biochemical pathways. So synthesis and breakdown of 3 major metabolic fuels are important. So the carbohydrates, the fats, and the proteins. Pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, and TCA cycle. So TCA cycle, the technical name for TCA cycle, let me look that up. It's also called the Krebs cycle. Has a couple of different names. Yeah, so TCA, tricarboxylic acid cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle, also called the Krebs cycle. Just some AKAs for you there. Start to learn those. So it's the Krebs cycle, the citric acid cycle, if I can spell, goodness, and the tricarboxylic acid cycle. All of those are AKAs of the same thing of TCA, and they will essentially end. We will end this trimester getting into the TCA cycle and kind of what it does. Okay. So pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, and TCA cycle intermediates. So those are some of the products that are produced in the formation of ATP. Are produced from carbohydrates, fatty acids, and amino acids. So liver is the major tissue for fuel metabolism. We'll talk a lot about how the liver is one of the big places that stores glucose. It'll store it in the form of glycogen. One common compound produced from the oxidative catabolism of proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids is acetyl coenzyme A. Okay, real quick. Oxidative catabolism, however you want to pronounce it. When we talk about oxidative, remember those reactions, oil, rig, oxidation is loss, so losing electrons. Catabolism is going to be talking about the breakdown. So the breakdown of complex molecules in living organisms to form simpler ones, together with the release of energy or destructive metabolism. So releases energy. It's the breaking down of stuff, okay? Remember, we need to remember that. So anabolic reaction, anabolism, is going to be putting things together, and it requires energy. We can think back a little bit. We talked about this. Catabolism is going to be exothermic or exergonic, and anabolic reactions are going to be endergonic or endothermic. Okay. The important thing is all of this is produced, all of these proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. The goal is to get to this point, to acetyl coenzyme A. Okay? Acetyl CoA also can be used to synthesize back those amino acids, glucose, and fatty acids. Finally, when acetyl CoA is metabolized through the Krebs cycle and through respiratory chain energy molecule, ATP is formed. So I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough here. We will get into all of the details of this as we go along, but what's important to kind of set the scene, glucose enters the body through, we eat it, it gets food gets digested in our stomach, and then it continues to get digested through the small intestine, and everything starts to get absorbed. The glucose will get absorbed through the small intestine and enter the bloodstream. Okay? When glucose enters the body and enters the blood, the pancreas is going to release insulin. We'll get into this a little bit more on what we see made by the beta cells of the pancreas. Okay? That will be something you need to remember from here on out. So the pancreas is going to release insulin into the blood. Okay? Insulin is an endocrine hormone, meaning that it's going to travel through the blood and act on a bunch of cells far away from its original source. So the insulin is going to bind to surface membrane receptors. And let's actually jump back and see this. There's a picture of it up here. Insulin's reaction is a little bit special. It's this guy right here, where the insulin binds, and you get this large phosphorylation reaction. I believe. Let me confirm what it's called. The tyrosine kinase. Yeah, I want to make sure I had that right. So the insulin signaling, so binding of insulin to its receptor, activates the intrinsic tyrosine kinase activity of the receptor. Okay? So the insulin binds to this membrane-bound receptor. This is not a G protein coupled receptor, okay? It is not a G protein coupled receptor. Insulin is its own type of receptor. We call it the tyrosine kinase receptor most of the time. So insulin binds, which going to inside of that receptor, as part of it, it has an intrinsic, so inside of it, tyrosine kinase activity. So the tyrosine kinase, remember kinase refers to phosphorylation. So literally inside it's going to phosphorylate tyrosine. Okay? Tyrosine kinase phosphorylates tyrosine residues of a target protein, such as the insulin receptor substrate, and a couple of those other funky names. We don't need to know those too well. Okay, and that is how it starts its reaction. Now, the job of insulin, the purpose of insulin, is when it activates those receptors, and then the tyrosine kinase activates. Remember that word, tyrosine kinase. When the tyrosine kinase activates, it's going to assist the uptake of glucose from the blood into the cell. Okay? Part of doing that, I won't get into all the specifics right now. We'll get into them later on. But know that it helps change the glucose so that the glucose can enter into the cell. Once the glucose is in the cell, the way that it gets used, if it's going to be used for energy, it goes through the process of glycolysis. Glycolysis. Okay? This glycolysis is an anaerobic reaction, or let's say process. Remember, anaerobic. Let me double check. I always get the anaerobic or aerobic mixed up. Yeah, good. So, the actual process of glycolysis is an anaerobic process, meaning that does not need oxygen. Okay? So essentially, we'll get into each of these individual steps in the full reaction, but understand that what it does is it turns glucose to pyruvate. That's the big idea. Okay? That's the job of glycolysis. Now, in a situation where we have oxygen, the pyruvate will be converted to that acetyl-CoA that we're talking about up here. Really, really important. And then acetyl-CoA enters the TCA cycle. The purpose of the TCA cycle is actually going to be to create a whole bunch of NADH. And then the NADH goes to the mitochondria, where then we have something called the electron transport chain, which then produces HECA ATP. This is a very rough outline. We're going to get through all of this eventually. I just wanted to give you a general idea of kind of what to expect from here on out. Okay, we're going to be talking about each of these things. There's a lot of reactions, a lot of steps, and honestly, there's a lot of memorization that's coming up soon with all of these reactions. But we'll get through those as they come up. Okay. Moving on. So here we go. So this whole chart is kind of similar to what we were just talking about. We have proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, right? Our main sources. The lipids get broken to fatty acid and glycerol. The carbohydrates go straight to glucose. And the proteins go to amino acid. And this is showing they can all be converted into that pyruvate and acetyl-CoA. Because remember, getting energy is the most important thing for our body, because without energy, we die. We get the citric acid cycle, which its function is to produce NADH. It also produces FADH2. It does the same thing as NADH. Okay, they have the same jobs. It's going to continue down. Oxidative phosphorylation. This is going to be happening inside of the mitochondria. Inside the mitochondria, we're going to be producing energy, and then by taking off those hydrogens, and there's a whole shebang that happens there. We won't get into it right now because it's a lot, and I don't want to confuse anybody. Then we get our NAD plus, FAD, our now fully oxidized forms. Remember, they've lost their electrons now. They've lost those hydrogens, and it's going to come back to the citric acid cycle and keep repeating to produce ATP. Okay. Now we're going to get into those hormones. So this is a good overview. Let's get into the actual hormones now. Now remember, when we talk about a hormone, hormonal control or hormone, we are talking about the endocrine system. What a hormone is a protein of some sort. Well, it can have a couple different sources. Hormone, let's say it's a molecule that is released into the bloodstream to have an effect on cells far away from its original source. Okay? Those are our hormones. From the pancreas, we have insulin. Insulin is going to be our glucose uptaker, so bringing the glucose into the cell. And glucagon is going to help us release glucose back into the blood. So understand this when and why these are going to be released. We'll get into all of that sort of stuff. Insulin will get released after we eat a big meal and we have our blood sugar starts to go higher. Insulin is going to bring that blood sugar down. Glucagon is if, let's say, when we go to sleep, we haven't eaten. We wake up and we're really, really hungry. We haven't eaten in 8+ hours. Glucagon is going to be helping us regulate to maintain our blood sugar up high enough so that we don't just pass out. We also have adrenal hormones. Adrenal, renal right here. Renal is kidney. The adrenal glands sit directly on top of the kidneys. And they're going to make epinephrine, norepinephrine, and cortisol. We'll mostly talk about cortisol, as that's a really, really important one in the maintenance of our glucose. Okay, so the combined action of the following hormones maintains normal blood glucose levels: insulin, glucagon, epinephrine, and cortisol. Hormonal signal to control blood glucose levels by liver, muscles, and adipocyte. Adipose tissue, so cyte meaning cell, adipose tissue meaning fat, so fat cells, which store those fatty acids. Okay? Insulin signals these tissues that blood glucose is higher than normal. So insulin is going to be released, remember, from those beta cells of the pancreas, and is going to travel through the blood and tell the liver, the muscles, and the adipocytes, hey, blood glucose is higher than it should be. Blood glucose is a little too high. So then those tissues are going to take up excess glucose from the blood and convert it to glycogen and fatty acids for storage. Okay, so far, keep a running list of vocab. We have glucose, which is the simple monosaccharide for sugar, right? That's what we're going to use for that energy. So that's monosaccharide. And now we have glycogen. Glycogen is the storage form of glucose. Okay? Meaning, so we want to be able to have glucose ready to use whenever we need it. So places like specifically the liver and muscles are going to store glucose in the form of glycogen in order to have energy on demand whenever they need it. Okay. So again, those tissues take up that excess glucose from the blood. They convert it to glycogen and fatty acids for storage. We'll get into how later on how they do fatty acids. Hormonal signal to control blood glucose levels by liver, muscle, and adipocyte. Glucagon. Remember, insulin, take the sugar into the cells because it's too high in the blood. Glucagon, it's too low in the blood, so let's get some of it out. Glucagon signals these cells that blood glucose is lower than normal. Tissues respond by breaking down glycogen by glycogenolysis. Okay, let's add. I'm just going to keep this down here with us. Glycogenolysis. And if we look at the word, it's right here. Glycogen is the storage form. Lysis, glycogen lysis. Lysis is the breakdown. So breaking down glycogen. And it releases glucose into the blood. It also promotes gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis. Glucose, new, genesis, create. So creation of new glucose. So the definition of this word is making glucose from non-carbohydrate sources. So things like proteins and fats. Okay. And this is important because our body can only use glucose. It needs glucose in order to function. So the way that it gets around that is that it can take those proteins and those fats and convert them into glucose. Okay? That gluconeogenesis primarily is going to be happening in the liver. Okay? The liver is going to be really, really important for a lot of this. Also, glycogenolysis. Breaking down of glycogen to be... let's leave it at that. To be breaking down glycogen. So, one key note that I do want to add in right here, the release glucose into the blood. This is liver specific. Okay? Once glucose has entered a muscle cell, it cannot leave the muscle cell. Okay, let me repeat that. Once glucose has entered a muscle cell, so an insulin has bound to a muscle cell, the muscle cell has taken in a glucose molecule, there's a reaction that occurs. It's escaping me right now, but we'll see it as we continue through exactly what that reaction is. But once it crosses over into a muscle cell, it cannot leave the muscle cell. Okay? So the liver primarily is what is going to be releasing glucose into the blood. Okay? So when you ask the question, glycogenolysis happen to increase blood levels of glucose happens where? In the liver. Gluconeogenesis as well, where does that occur? It's going to occur in the liver. Okay. Tissues oxidize fats to reduce glucose usage and also supplies acetyl-CoA to form glucose. Now, epinephrine and cortisol. So epinephrine is released into the blood to prepare muscles, lungs, and heart for a quick burst of activity. The other name for epinephrine is adrenaline. Adrenaline. Okay? So adrenaline is released into the blood to prepare muscle, lung, and heart for a quick burst of activity. So that's going to be like the epinephrine gets released, and it's going to cause a quick reaction like, okay, let's prep, and it makes sure that the blood sugar stays up high, so that way we can use a bunch of energy and get it into the cells and get us moving, get the energy to the muscles that needs it. Cortisol mediates the body's response to longer-term stresses. This is actually why they say that stress can cause weight gain, because when we are stressed, our cortisol levels increase. With increased cortisol levels, it means that our blood sugar tends to remain higher for longer, which can eventually end up leading to weight gain and other issues. Okay? Okay. So insulin and glucagon are antagonists to each other to regulate blood glucose levels. That means that they do opposite things. The pancreatic beta cells of the isolates of Langerhans, remember this, beta cells of the isolates of Langerhans, secretes insulin. The pancreatic alpha cells of the isolates of Langerhans secretes glucagon. Alpha cells, beta cells. There's also something that's called delta cells in the pancreas, but we'll get into that later. That does a different function as well. So insulin. So we're actually going to pause right here to get into, and I'll do another video just specifically talking about insulin and how and the actions of insulin. This is going to be a very, very important part, so I want to make sure that we kind of pause and have some time to absorb this material first before moving on. Okay, I will see you in the next video.